The last thing my father said to me before the judge slammed the gavel was, "It's time to live in the real world. Elara, dreams don't pay the bills." He was right about one thing. I stopped dreaming that day. My name is Elara Croft, and for 10 years, I lived a secret life. My father and the judge who aided him thought they had left me with nothing. But they were wrong. They left me with a key, hidden in the one thing they let me keep, my mother's vintage locket. And I spent a decade using it to unlock the door to their destruction. The polished marble floor of the county courthouse shone with a cold, impersonal gleam, reflecting the sterile fluorescent lights above like a still, frozen river. I walked its length with my head down, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous hallway, each one a hammer blow against the silence. The air smelled of lemon-scented disinfectant and old paper, a scent that would forever be etched in my memory as the smell of loss. I was 18 years old, and the black dress I wore felt like a costume for a role I never auditioned for. It was too severe, too final for someone my age. Beside me, my father, Julian Croft, moved with an easy, confident stride. His custom-tailored suit probably cost more than our family car from a decade ago. He didn't look at me. His focus was straight ahead, on the imposing oak doors of the courtroom, his battlefield. To anyone else, we might have looked like a grieving family, united in sorrow. But the space between us was a chasm, and he was the one who had pushed me to the edge. My mother, Elena, had been the bridge between us. Her sudden death in a car accident 6 months ago had shattered my world, and now my father was systematically sweeping up the pieces and discarding them. Today he was here to make it legal. The courtroom was hushed, a theater of whispered anxieties. We took our seats at the defendant's table, my father, his high-priced legal shark, Markham Sterling, and me. My own representation, a public defender named David, fresh out of law school and smelling of cheap coffee and desperation, sat to my left, his knee bouncing nervously under the table. Judge Eleanor Thorne entered, her black robes flowing behind her like wings of judgment. She was a woman, in her late 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes the color of flint. Her gaze swept over the room, pausing on my father for a fraction of a second longer than on anyone else. A look I was too young and too distraught to decipher at the time, but which now, in memory, looks unmistakably like collusion. "The court is now in session," the bailiff announced, his voice a dull boom. The proceedings began. My father's lawyer, Sterling, stood with practiced elegance. "Your Honor," he began, his voice a smooth, mellifluous instrument designed to soothe and persuade. "We are here today out of profound concern. The tragic passing of Elena Croft has left a void, and my client, Mr. Julian Croft, is acting solely out of a father's love and duty." I clutched the silver locket at my throat, my mother's most cherished possession. It was cool against my skin, a small, solid anchor in a world that was dissolving around me. She had never taken it off. Since her mother's death, Sterling continued, painting a picture with his words, "Miss Elara has demonstrated a pattern of instability, withdrawn from her university arts program, accumulated significant personal debt." He slid a piece of paper across the table. A single maxed-out credit card. "Your Honor, for a young woman with no income, this is a glaring red flag for financial irresponsibility. The debt was for groceries and utilities, accrued in the numb, gray weeks after the funeral when getting out of bed felt like a Herculean task. They were twisting my grief into a pathology." David stood up, his voice reedy in comparison. "Objection, Your Honor. My client was grieving. These are isolated incidents being taken out of context." "Overruled," Judge Thorne said, her voice clipped. "Proceed, Mr. Sterling." My father then took the stand. He looked the picture of somber, responsible parenthood. "Your Honor, Elara is a dreamer," he said, his tone dripping with a condescending concern that made my stomach clench. "Her head is always in the clouds. She creates these digital art projects. While her mother and I admired her creativity, the real world requires pragmatism. This inheritance, the house, the savings, her college fund, it's a weight that will crush her. I'm only trying to protect my daughter from herself." The lies were so seamless, so perfectly crafted. He made my mother's support sound like a gentle indulgence for a hobby, not the proud encouragement of a parent who believed in her child's future. He was erasing her and me in front of everyone. I felt David's hand on my arm under the table, a silent plea to stay calm. My knuckles were white where I gripped the locket. The evidence continued. A missed therapy appointment, framed as a refusal to get help, A single late payment on a phone bill presented as a spiral into financial chaos. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, and Judge Thorne absorbed every word with a solemn nod. When it was finally over, the judge didn't even hesitate. Her gavel, a polished piece of wood that looked like a weapon, came down with a crack that seemed to split the air in two. The court finds the petitioner's concerns valid and compelling. Guardianship of the estate of Elena Croft, including all properties, financial assets, and holdings, is hereby granted to Julian Croft, to be held in trust until such time as the court deems Elara Croft capable of managing them independently. The words were a physical blow. The air left my lungs. The house I grew up in, filled with the echoes of my mother's laughter, the college fund she had meticulously saved for, the financial security that was her final gift to me, gone. All of it. Legally severed from me. As the room began to empty, my father walked over to me. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch making my skin crawl. "Elara," he said, his voice low, for my ears only. The false concern was gone, replaced by a cold, hard satisfaction. "This is for the best. It's time you learned that the real world doesn't run on dreams and pretty pictures. Your mother never understood that. Look where it got her." The callousness of it, the veiled threat in his words, stole what little breath I had left. He turned and walked away, following Sterling out of the courtroom without a backward glance. A court officer handed me a single sad cardboard box. "Your personal effects from the estate," he said, not unkindly. Inside were a few photo albums, my mother's favorite novels, and a small jewelry box containing costume pieces. The debris of a life. I walked out of the courthouse and into a gray, drizzling afternoon. The rain misted my face, mingling with the tears I could no longer hold back. I stood on the steps, the box in my arms, watching the city move on, indifferent to my world ending. I had nowhere to go. I had $43 in my wallet. But as I stood there, shivering and utterly alone, my fingers found their way back to my mother's locket. I clicked it open. Inside was a small, faded picture of the two of us smiling. A quiet, fierce fire ignited in my chest, cutting through the numbness. He thought he had taken everything. He thought he had won. But as I walked down the courthouse steps into the rain, a new resolve took root. He had left me with nothing but a broken heart and a silver locket. I would use both to break him. The game wasn't over. It had just begun, and I would spend the next 10 years learning how to win it. The first night was the longest of my life. I used most of my $43 to pay for a week at the Starlight Motel, a place whose name was a monument to false advertising. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and despair. The floral pattern on the bedspread faded into a ghost of itself. I placed the cardboard box on the rickety table and stared at it. This was the sum total of my life now. A cubic foot of memories in a room that charged by the hour. The neon sign outside my window flickered, painting the walls a sickly red, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's smug face and heard the final, damning crack of the gavel. By 4 a.m., a cold, clear fury had burned away the last of my shock and self-pity. He wanted me to live in the real world? Fine. I would build a new one, a world he couldn't touch. My one advantage was my mind. My passion for digital art had always been more than just creating pretty pictures. It was about understanding systems, code, and the architecture of digital spaces, a hobby my mother had nurtured and my father had dismissed as a waste of time. Now it was my only weapon. That morning, using the motel's shaky Wi-Fi, I began the process of my own digital rebirth. Elara Croft, the disinherited art student, began to fade. In her place, I built Kestrel. Name came to me as I watched a hawk, circling outside my window, solitary, sharp-eyed, and lethal. Kestrel was a ghost in the machine, a freelance digital artist and coder, available for hire on platforms that didn't ask for a real name, only a portfolio and a PayPal address. The first jobs were brutal, mind-numbing grunt work, data entry, formatting sloppy websites, editing blurry product photos for pennies. I lived on instant noodles and tap water. My world shrunk to the glow of my laptop screen in that dim, soulless room. Every dollar saved was a bullet for a war my father didn't know we were fighting. After 2 weeks, the motel manager knocked on my door, his eyes lingering on the single box that constituted my existence. "You gotta go," he said flatly. "Weekly rates up." I spent that night in the 24-hour public library, using their computers to find more work while my own laptop charged. The next day, I found a room for rent in a crowded house with 5 other people. My bedroom was a converted walk-in closet. It was humiliating, the air thick with the smells of strangers cooking, but it was cheap, and it had a lock on the door. This became my new normal. By day, I was Kestrel, the efficient, anonymous freelancer. By night, I was Alara, the ghost, studying advanced coding, cryptography, and digital forensics with a focus that bordered on fanaticism. My grief had been a heavy fog. My rage was a laser, and I was learning how to aim it. Months bled into a year. My skills grew, and with them my reputation. Kestrel became known for clean code, sharp design, and unwavering reliability. I started landing better contracts, moving from simple fixes to building secure communication, platforms, and intricate digital assets for small businesses. The work was still anonymous, but it paid enough that I could move out of the closet and into a studio apartment. It was a single room with a leaking faucet and a view of a brick wall, but it was mine. I bought a second-hand desk and a decent chair. This was my command center. Throughout it all, my mother's locket never left my neck. I would often find myself holding it, tracing its smooth, cool surface with my thumb. The only physical connection I had left to her. It was my talisman, my reason for pushing through another sleepless night, for enduring another client's ridiculous demands. One night, during a violent thunderstorm that rattled my window pane, a deep wave of despair threatened to pull me under. The memory of that motel room, the feeling of absolute powerlessness, was a ghost that still haunted me. I needed to feel close to her, to fix something, anything. I took off the locket. The clasp had been delicate even before the accident, and now it was bent, refusing to close properly. I found the small screwdriver set I used for computer repairs and, with painstaking care, began to try and gently straighten the tiny metal loop. My hand, slick with nervous sweat, slipped. The screwdriver skidded, applying too much pressure to the side of the locket's main casing. With a faint, almost inaudible click, a seam I never knew existed popped open. A hidden compartment. My breath hitched. I froze, staring at the tiny, hairline gap now visible on the locket's silver edge. Heart hammering against my ribs, I used a razor blade to carefully pry it open. Inside, something tiny and metallic was nestled. It wasn't a photo or a lock of hair. It was a micro SD card, no larger than a fingernail clipping, sealed in a tiny, transparent protective sleeve. My hands trembled as I held it under my desk lamp. This was no accident. My mother had hidden this. With shaking fingers, I plugged it into an adapter and inserted it into my laptop. The drive contained only 2 files, a text document named coordinates.txt and a single, heavily encrypted file named echo.jrn. I opened the text file. It contained a string of numbers, map coordinates, and beneath them, 2 words written in a simple code-like font. Project Echo. The name meant nothing to me. It sounded like a bad corporate team-building exercise. But the precision of the coordinates, the secretiveness of the hiding place, this was deliberate. This was important. My mother, the cheerful, creative data architect, had been hiding a secret. The encrypted file was a fortress. It would take Kestrel's skills to breach it. For the next 72 hours, I barely slept, surviving on coffee and a burning need to know. I wrote custom decryption scripts, leveraging every ounce of knowledge I had acquired. Finally, with a final line of code, the digital fortress fell. It was a journal. Her journal. Page after digital page, in her own words. I read and my world tilted off its axis. Project Echo wasn't a corporate project. It was a conspiracy. My father's company, Croft Data Systems, in collusion with then-JAG officer Eleanor Thorne, had been installing backdoors in government servers they were hired to secure. They were siphoning sensitive data, military designs, economic forecasts, diplomatic communications, and selling it to private defense, contractors, and foreign corporations through a network of shell companies. They were traders, and they were getting rich from it. My mother, the lead architect on the project, had discovered the truth. The journal's final entry was dated 3 days before her death. Julian knows I know. He came into my office tonight. He was smiling, but his eyes were dead. He told me I looked tired, that I should be careful on the roads given how stressed I've been. It wasn't concern. It was a threat. A very specific, very clear threat. I've copied the core evidence and hidden it. If anything happens to me, my darling Alara, look to the locket. Follow the path. I love you more than anything in this world. I read that passage over and over until the words were burned into my soul. The cracked clasp wasn't from the accident. It was from the force of the impact he had engineered. It wasn't an accident. It was a silencing. The man who had stood in court and spoken of. My instability had coldly orchestrated the murder of the woman I loved most. A primal scream built in my chest, but I forced it down. Rage was a luxury I couldn't afford. It clouded judgment. My mother hadn't given me this evidence for a reckless confrontation. She had given me the power to dismantle his entire world, brick by bloody brick. The freelance work that had been my survival was now my weapon. My obsession had a new, precise target. I dove into the darkest corners of the internet. The places Kestrel was never meant to go. I needed to understand the full scope of Project Echo. I needed an ally who knew the players. After weeks of dead-end searches, I found a crack. On an obscure forum dedicated to government transparency, a user with the handle Sentinel7 had commented on a thread years ago about data breaches in military contracts. The comment was vague, but it used a specific uncommon term I'd seen in my mother's journal: asymmetric data harvesting. Sent a carefully worded, encrypted message, posing as a journalist researching Cold War-era data vulnerabilities. Weeks passed with no response. I had almost given up when a reply appeared in my secure inbox. It was brief and wary. "Meet me, the Aegis Cafe on 5th Street, tomorrow 3 p.m., come alone." The seed of a plan, nurtured by grief and fury, was finally breaking through the soil. The ghost was ready to become a hunter. The Aegis Cafe was a quiet, bookish place that smelled of roasted coffee beans and old, well-loved paper. I arrived 20 minutes early, choosing a corner table shrouded in shadow, my back to the wall. My laptop was open, displaying nothing more incriminating than a coding project. But my senses were on high alert, every nerve-ending buzzing. The locket felt heavy against my chest, a constant, cool reminder of why I was here. At exactly 3 p.m., a man entered. He was in his late 60s, with a close-cropped silver beard and the upright, vigilant posture of someone who had spent a lifetime in uniform, even in civilian clothes. His eyes, a sharp, assessing blue, scanned the room once before landing on me with unnerving accuracy. He knew who I was. He slid into the seat opposite me, placing his hands flat on the table. No handshake. "You're Elena's daughter," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. It wasn't a question. "How did you—" "Marcus Vance," he interrupted. "I worked with your mother at the Defense Intelligence Agency before she moved to the private sector." He studied my face, and the stern lines around his mouth softened marginally. "You have her eyes." The mention of my mother, from someone who had known her in a life before me, was a punch to the gut. "She was a data architect," I said, the statement feeling suddenly, woefully inadequate. Marcus gave a thin, humorless smile. "That was her cover, a title for the org charts. Your mother, Elena, was one of the most brilliant counterintelligence analysts I've ever met. She specialized in tracking digital espionage. She was assigned to a joint task force auditing private contractors, including your father's firm." My world tilted. My mom, a spy hunter? The woman who sang off-key in the kitchen and cried at sad movies? I don't understand," I stammered, the foundation of my childhood shifting beneath me. "I'm not surprised. She left the agency when she married Julian. He was a young, ambitious JAG officer on the same task force. Charmed her right out of her career." Marcus's tone was laced with a bitterness that had aged like fine wine. "She thought she was leaving the secrets behind. She was wrong." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Project Echo wasn't an official operation. It was the internal name for the scheme your father and his associates concocted. They were the threat she was hired to find. Judge Thorne was their inside woman, steering audits away, burying reports. The pieces began to click into place with terrifying, logical precision. My father's rapid rise, his seemingly endless wealth. It wasn't genius or business acumen. It was treason, packaged as corporate success. My mother found out," I whispered, the truth dawning like a horrible sunrise. "She documented everything," Marcus confirmed, his eyes grave. "She was building a case to take to the FBI, but then she got pregnant with you. She stayed silent to protect you. She thought if she buried the evidence and never spoke of it, you'd be safe." He looked at me, and the full weight of his meaning settled in the space between us. "Her accident. Alara, there were irregularities in the police report. A witness who recanted. A missing security camera tape from a nearby traffic light. The air left my lungs. The locket felt like a millstone. It wasn't an accident. It couldn't be." Marcus saw the realization on my face and nodded slowly. "She kept a master file. Meticulous. Network diagrams. Bank routing numbers for the shell companies. Recorded conversations. She hid it somewhere safe before she died. She told me if anything ever happened to her, I was to watch over you. And if Julian ever came after you, I was to tell you to look to the locket." I see you finally did. I sat there paralyzed. The man who had disowned me in court wasn't just a ruthless businessman. He was a traitor, and my mother's death was a calculated hit. The grief I had carried for years mutated in an instant. It was no longer a soft, aching sadness. It was a hard, diamond-sharp core of vengeance. My father hadn't just taken my inheritance. He had taken my mother. I looked at Marcus, my voice steady for the first time in years. I need to find that master file. A grim smile touched his lips. I was hoping you'd say that. The coordinates from the micro SD card led to a self-storage facility on the industrial edge of the city, a place of echoing concrete and rolling steel doors. Unit 217, of course. The time on the police report for her accident. Getting inside was the first test of my new skills. The facility used a digital lock system, archaic and easily bypassed with a custom script. I wrote that mimicked a maintenance override. The door to Unit 217 rolled up with a hollow metallic groan, revealing a space not much larger than my former closet. In the center, shrouded in a fine layer of dust, sat a single gunmetal gray server rack. My hands didn't shake this time. There was a grim certainty to my movements. It was powered, humming softly. A biometric scanner was attached. My mother's birthday didn't work. My birthday didn't work. I input the numerical sequence from the micro SD card. A green light flashed. The server unlocked. Inside, nestled amidst the blinking lights, was a stack of solid-state hard drives. This was her arsenal. This was her testament. For the next week, I ingested the contents of those drives. It was all there, just as Marcus had said. My mother's digital fingerprints were all over the evidence. Elegant. Data visualizations mapping the flow of stolen information. Audio files of my father and Thorne discussing asset, liquidation, and pristine copies of doctored financial statements. One file contained a video taken from a hidden camera in her office, showing my father handing Judge Thorne an envelope of cash. It was dated just 1 week after she had ruled in his favor during a key contract dispute. But the most chilling file was an audio log, timestamped the night before her death. He's becoming paranoid. He knows I've copied the core evidence. He asked me today, in that sweet voice he uses when he's most dangerous, if I ever thought about how fragile life is. He mentioned the brakes on my car felt spongy and that I should get them checked. A threat disguised as concern. It's time. I've moved the evidence to the secure location. If anything happens to me, my beautiful Ilara, know that I loved you more than life itself. And know the truth. I listened to her voice, steady and clear even in fear, until her words were a mantra in my mind. It wasn't an accident. It was an assassination. A primal roar built in my chest, but I forced it down. Rage was a luxury I couldn't afford. It clouded judgment. My mother hadn't given me this evidence for a reckless confrontation. She had given me the power to dismantle his entire world, brick by bloody brick. The hard drives contained digital copies of everything, plus more, email archives, encrypted financial ledgers. This was my nuclear option, but launching it directly would be suicide. My father and his allies were too powerful, too entrenched. I needed a different approach, a siege, not a frontal assault. My freelance identity, Kestrel, was no longer just a front for survival. It became my vehicle. Using the seed money I'd saved, I formally incorporated Aegis Digital, a cybersecurity firm. The name was a quiet nod to the cafe where my war council had begun. I rented a small, proper office, a single room in a shared business suite, and hired my first employee. Lena, a brilliant, fiercely ethical lawyer I'd vetted for months. I told her a version of the truth. That I was building a secure data analytics firm, and that we might, in the future, take on powerful interests engaged in corruption. She was intrigued, her own sense of justice ignited. Our first major contract was with the city, to overhaul their public library network's digital security. It was legitimate, profitable work that gave us credibility. The next was with a small, innovative drone manufacturer. I sought out companies on the rise, ones that threatened the old guard my father's world represented. Meanwhile, in the deepest, most encrypted layers of our own servers, I began constructing the Vault. It was a decentralized, automated dead man's switch. I uploaded every piece of evidence, the journal, the financial records, the damning video and audio files. I configured it with multiple triggers. If I failed to input a complex code every 48 hours, if my heartbeat stopped as registered by my fitness tracker, it would automatically and anonymously send the entire package to the Department of Justice, the IRS, the NSA, and 3 major international news outlets. My father couldn't silence me without ensuring his own very public destruction. One evening, Lena stayed late, reviewing a contract. She looked up from her laptop, her expression thoughtful. "Alara, I've been running a conflict of interest check on our potential clients. One of them, Orion Dynamics, is a major subcontractor for Croft Data Systems." My blood ran cold. Croft Data Systems was my father's flagship company. The battlefield was coming into view. "Are they clean?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "They seem to be. But it's a minefield. If we take their business and your father finds out you're involved—" "He can't know," I said sharply. "Not yet. The name on all the documents is Kestrel. As far as the world is concerned, Alara Croft is still a failed artist scraping by." She nodded slowly, understanding there was more at play than she knew. "Understood." A week later, the opportunity I'd been waiting for and dreading presented itself. Marcus, who had been monitoring my father's business through his own network of contacts, sent a secure message. "Croft Data Systems is over-leveraged. They're all in on a new federal contract, Project Chimera. They need a significant cash infusion to cover development costs. They're getting desperate." Project Chimera. The irony was exquisite. It was one of the shell companies my mother had documented in her files. Lena's eyes widened. "Alara, that's aggressive, and the capital required—" "Is available," I finished for her. I had been moving Kestrel's profits through a labyrinth of accounts for years, preparing for this moment. Orion Dynamics is a key supplier for Project Chimera. If we control Orion, we control a critical piece of my father's flagship project. It was a move straight out of his playbook, using corporate structures and financial leverage as weapons. I was learning to speak his language, and I was proving to be a fluent student. The plan was set in motion. The acquisition was complex, layered, and entirely anonymous. Through a web of intermediaries, Aegis Holdings became the majority stakeholder in Orion Dynamics. My father, desperate to secure his contract, would have no idea that the company he was relying on was now controlled by the daughter he had thrown away. I stood at the window of my small office, looking out at the city. Somewhere out there, in his corner office atop the Croft Data Systems tower, my father was plotting his next move, confident in his power and his impunity. He thought he had buried the past. He thought he had broken me. But the ghost he had created was now a shareholder in his downfall. The silent siege had begun. The air in the boardroom of Orion Dynamics was cool and sterile, smelling of expensive coffee and thinly veiled anxiety. I sat at the head of the table, not as Alara Croft, but as Kestrel, the reclusive tech investor who had just become their majority stakeholder. The CEO, a perpetually nervous man named Robert Walsh, kept mopping his brow with a silk handkerchief. "The Project Chimera timelines are aggressive," Robert said, sliding a document across the polished table. "Croft Data Systems is demanding accelerated delivery on the sensor arrays. Their project manager is threatening to levy massive penalties for any delays." I kept my expression neutral, a mask of detached business interest. Inside, my heart was a steady, determined drum. This was the first tangible pressure point, and I was about to squeeze it. "Penalties are a standard part of any contract," I said, my voice even. "However, our due diligence revealed some interesting findings about Croft Data Systems' financial stability for this project." I nodded to Lena, who sat beside me, the picture of professional composure. Lena opened a folder. "Our analysis indicates that Croft Data Systems is operating on extremely thin margins. For Project Chimera, they've leveraged nearly all their assets to secure the initial funding. A significant delay, or even the threat of one, could trigger covenant violations with their primary lenders." She looked directly at Robert. "In short, they need you more than you need them." Robert's eyes widened. This was not the conversation he had been expecting from his new, silent partner. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. A slow, understanding smile spread across Robert's face as he grasped the shifting power dynamic. 8 weeks. That would put them in breach of their contract with the Pentagon. "Precisely," I said softly. The call was made. I listened on speakerphone as Robert delivered the news. The sputtering rage on the other end of the line was a symphony to my ears. It was a junior executive, but the panic was palpable. The first domino had been tipped. The retaliation was swift, though not aimed at me. Not yet. 2 days later, a thick legal document was delivered to my apartment by courier. It was not addressed to Kestrel, but to Alara Croft, My father was suing me again. The pretext was laughably thin. He claimed that a conceptual design for a data encryption protocol I had sketched in a notebook as a teenager. A notebook he'd taken possession of after the first trial was the intellectual property of Croft Data Systems. He was demanding I cease all use of it and assign the rights to him. The lawsuit was for a mere $50,000. It wasn't about the money. It was a warning shot, a reminder that he could reach out and disrupt my life whenever he wished. He was the cat, and I was the mouse he was still toying with. But he had no idea this mouse had grown teeth and built a fortress. The lawsuit also revealed something critical. The case had been assigned to Judge Eleanor Thorne. The circle was closing. The same judge, the same courtroom, a decade later. This time, however, I wasn't a scared girl. I was a prepared general. The day of the hearing arrived. Walking into that courtroom was like stepping into a recurring nightmare. The same mahogany, the same stale air, the same imposing figure of Judge Albright on the bench. And there at the opposing table was my father. He looked older, the lines on his face deeper, but the arrogance was undimmed. He gave me a condescending smile as I entered, a look that said, "We're doing this again?" His lawyer, a different shark from the same firm, stood and began his argument. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. Ms. Croft developed this concept while living under her father's roof, using his resources. The intellectual property rightly belongs to Croft Data Systems." I sat calmly, letting him finish his theatrical presentation. My father watched me, expecting to see fear, desperation. He saw none. When it was my turn, Lena stood. "Your Honor, this is a frivolous lawsuit, a clear attempt to harass my client. The concept in question is a basic encryption, principle taught in undergraduate computer science courses. Furthermore, we move for Your Honor's recusal from this case." The courtroom, which had been murmuring, fell silent. Judge Thorne's eyebrows shot up. "On what grounds, counselor?" "On the grounds of a profound conflict of interest," Lena said, her voice ringing with authority. She didn't elaborate. She didn't present evidence. She simply let the accusation hang in the air, a grenade with the pin pulled. My father's lawyer shot to his feet. "Outrageous! This is a baseless, slanderous accusation." Judge Thorne's face was a mask of cold fury. "Miss Petrova, you will provide evidence for this allegation immediately, or I will hold you in contempt." This was the moment. The carefully laid plan was reaching its climax. Lena looked at me. I gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. I stood. The eyes of the entire courtroom swung to me. My father was smirking, believing I was about to make a fool of myself. "Your Honor," I said, my voice calm and clear, cutting through the tension. "If I may approach the bench? There is a matter of national security, a code word, from a previous joint assignment that I believe you will recognize." A ripple of confusion went through the room. "National security?" My father's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. Judge Thorne stared at me, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. She was weighing the risk. To refuse would look suspicious. To agree was to walk into my trap. After what felt like an eternity, she gave a sharp, reluctant nod. "Approach." The bailiff moved to escort me, but I waved him away. I walked the short distance to the bench alone, my footsteps echoing in the silent room. My father watched, his confidence visibly crumbling with every step I took. I reached the bench. Judge Thorne leaned down, her face a cold, impassive mask. Up close, I could see the fine lines around her eyes, the tight set of her jaw. She thought she still held all the power. I leaned forward, just close enough that my whisper would be for her ears only. The entire courtroom was holding its breath. I could feel my father's frantic gaze burning into my back. I didn't mention the server rack. I didn't mention the shell companies or the stolen data. I simply whispered the two words that tied her, irrevocably, to my father's crime. Project Echo. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The color drained from Judge Thorne's face so completely she looked like a corpse. Her eyes, once so hard and sure, widened in pure, unadulterated terror. Her hand, resting on the gavel, began to tremble so violently the wooden block rattled against its base. She tried to speak, but only a choked, guttural sound escaped her lips. She knew, in that single horrifying instant, she knew that I knew everything. She knew that the past they had worked so hard to bury had just been exhumed, and I was holding its rotting corpse. The room was utterly silent, every person frozen, trying to comprehend the silent drama unfolding before them. They couldn't hear the words, but they could see the result. They saw the powerful, unflappable judge reduced to a terrified pale ghost. I didn't move. I just held her gaze, letting the full weight of those 2 words crush her. This was for my mother. This was for every moment of fear and poverty I had endured. This was the beginning of the end for both of them. Judge Thorne finally found her voice, though it was a strained, broken thing. "The court will recess," she stammered. Indefinitely. She practically fled the bench, her robes swirling around her, leaving a courtroom in stunned, buzzing confusion. My father was on his feet, his face a thundercloud of confusion and dawning fear. He had no idea what I had said, but he had seen its power. He had seen his most powerful ally shattered by a whisper. I turned and walked back to my seat, my posture straight, my head high. I didn't look at my father. I didn't need to. The victory was already mine. The war wasn't over, but I had just won the most important battle. I had stripped them of their power and their composure. The siege was over. The walls had been breached. Now it was time for the final reckoning. The silence in the courtroom didn't last. It shattered into a cacophony of frantic whispers, the scraping of chairs as journalists scrambled for the door, and the low, urgent murmurs of legal professionals who knew they had just witnessed something unprecedented. I remained standing beside Lena, a strange, cold calm settling over me. Across the aisle, my father stood frozen, his face a grotesque mask of confusion and dawning terror. His lawyer was pulling at his sleeve, speaking in low, frantic tones, but Julian Croft was deaf to everything but the echo of his crumbling world. He finally broke from his stupor, striding toward me, his composure in tatters. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice a low, venomous hiss meant only for me. The scent of his expensive cologne, once a symbol of his unassailable status, now smelled like desperation. "What did you say to her?" I turned to face him fully, meeting his gaze for the first time in a decade as an equal. No, not an equal. As his superior. "I just reminded her of an old project you both worked on," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. She seemed to remember it quite vividly. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of understanding and then pure, unadulterated panic. He knew. He knew the secret was out. "You have no idea what you're playing with, Alara," he spat. "This will destroy you." "It already did," I replied calmly. "You made sure of that 10 years ago. The difference is, now I'm not the one who's going to be destroyed." Lena gently touched my arm. "Alara, we should go." We walked out of the courtroom, leaving my father standing alone in the swirling chaos. The victory was cold, but it was sweet. The fallout was swift and brutal. By that evening, news alerts blared across the internet. Judge Eleanor Thorne submits sudden resignation. Cites health reasons. The legal and business communities buzzed with speculation, but the truth remained a tightly held secret between a few of us. Without her protection, my father's lawsuit against me collapsed and was dismissed with prejudice. Lena gently touched my arm. "Alara, we should go." We walked out of the courtroom, leaving my father standing alone in the swirling chaos. The victory was cold, but it was sweet. The fallout was swift and brutal. By that evening, news alerts blared across the internet. Judge Eleanor Thorne submits sudden resignation. Cites health reasons. The legal and business communities buzzed with speculation, but the truth remained a tightly held secret between a few of us. Without her protection, my father's lawsuit against me collapsed and was dismissed with prejudice. But that was just the beginning. A week after the courtroom incident, I initiated the final phase of my plan. Using the control we exerted over Orion Dynamics, we made the delay on the Project Chimera components permanent. A formally worded letter citing irreconcilable technical failures was sent to Croft Data Systems, effectively halting the entire project. It was the kill shot. The dominoes fell with a satisfying rhythm. Croft Data Systems missed its deadline with the Pentagon. The contract worth billions was voided. The news triggered a cascade of loan covenant violations. Their stock price, which I had been quietly shorting through another layer of shell companies, began a death spiral. My anonymous investment vehicles, armed with the capital I had built over a decade, began buying up his company's debt for pennies on the dollar. I wasn't just breaking him. I was buying the pieces at a fire sale. The end came on a rainy Tuesday. I received a call from the lead independent director of Croft Data Systems Board. His voice was strained, obsequious. They had discovered the extent of the financial catastrophe and had voted to oust my father as CEO. They were requesting an emergency meeting with Kestrel, their largest debtor, to discuss a debt-for-equity swap that would effectively hand me control of the company. I agreed to the meeting. I didn't go to the boardroom. I went directly to the apex of my father's world, the CEO's office on the top floor of the Croft Data Systems tower. The air was thin and rarefied, thick with the scent of his expensive Cuban cigars and polished failure. His executive assistant, a woman named Cynthia, who had once told me my father was in a critical meeting when I'd come to see him after winning a school science fair, looked up as I entered. Her face, usually a mask of cool efficiency, crumpled into shock and fear. "Miss Croft, Ilara, you can't—" "He'll see me," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. I pushed open the heavy mahogany double doors. The office was a monument to his ego. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a God's-eye view of the city he had once thought he owned. My father was standing before them, his back to the room, his shoulders slumped. The room was in disarray. He turned slowly. The transformation was shocking. The man who had always seemed larger than life now looked shrunken, his custom suit hanging loosely on his frame. His eyes, once so full of cunning and contempt, were hollow. "Ilara," he rasped. The word was a surrender. "I suppose you've come to take a final look at your handiwork." "I came to give you a choice," I said, walking to the center of the room. My shoes sank into the plush Persian rug. "The last one you'll ever get." He let out a dry, cracked laugh that held no humor. "A choice? You've annihilated me. You've taken my company, my legacy." "Your legacy?" I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to make him flinch. "Your legacy is treason and murder. You built this empire on stolen secrets and blood money. And when my mother discovered the truth, you had her killed to protect it. Don't you dare talk to me about legacy." The accusation spoken aloud in this, his inner sanctum, seemed to physically wound him. He staggered back a step, his hand groping for the edge of his desk for support. "That's a lie," he whispered, but the words had no force, no conviction. "I have it all, Julian," I said, using his first name, stripping him of his title as my father. "Elena's journal, the server logs, the video of you handing Thorne a bribe, the audio of you threatening my mother. I have a digital dead man's switch that will send it all to the FBI, the NSA, and the Washington Post if my heart stops beating. Your entire life is a single keystroke away from becoming a federal case and a front-page scandal." He was crumbling before my eyes, the facade of the powerful tycoon dissolving into the essence of a terrified, cornered man. What is the choice?" "You will sign a full legally binding confession," I said, pulling a document from my inner suit pocket. I laid it on his desk, the crisp white paper a stark contrast to the rich, dark wood. "It details everything. The data theft from Project Echo, the network of shell companies, the conspiracy with Thorne, and your role in the murder of Elena Croft." I paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "You will resign from every board, every trust, every public position. You will walk away from every remaining asset, which will be liquidated. You will disappear into the obscurity you always thought was worse than death." He stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake. "And if I do this, the evidence?" "Remains with me," I said. "You will not go to prison. You will live out your days in a small, anonymous apartment with a modest, monitored allowance. You will have to wake up every single morning and look in the mirror, knowing that the daughter you discarded, the dreamer, holds the power to destroy you completely. That will be your punishment. To live with the knowledge of your own utter and complete defeat, knowing I am the one who showed you mercy." The silence in the room was absolute. He looked from the confession to the city skyline, the kingdom he was losing, and then back to me. The fight was gone. All that was left was a hollowed-out shell. He had built his life on a foundation of sand, and the tide I had unleashed had washed it all away. Slowly, painfully, he shuffled to his desk. He picked up his favorite pen, a heavy, gold-plated monstrosity. His hand trembled so violently he could barely uncap it. He didn't read the document. There was no point. He leaned over and, with a hand that shook, signed his name at the bottom of the last page. It was over. I picked up the signed confession, folded it, and placed it back inside my jacket. I turned and walked toward the door without another word. "Ilara," he called out, his voice a broken whisper. I stopped but didn't turn around. Did she ever suspect? Before the end, I closed my eyes, seeing my mother's face, her smile, the love in her eyes that this man had extinguished. "She knew," I said softly. And she still loved the man she thought you were. That's the real tragedy. I walked out, leaving him alone in the ruins of his life. The doors clicked shut behind me, the sound as final as a gavel. Down in the lobby, I stepped out into the cool evening air. The city bustled around me, oblivious. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of freedom, of closure. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my mother's locket. I clicked it open, looking at our faded photo. The cracked clasp was no longer a symbol of a life broken, but of a truth revealed. A single quiet thought echoed in the new stillness of my soul. It's done, Mom. You can rest now. And so can I. I stand now in the bright, sunlit computer lab of the Eleanor Croft Foundation for Digital Ethics, watching a group of young women passionately debugging a complex piece of code. Their laughter is the music of a future my mother would have loved. Her locket rests in a simple glass case by the entrance, no longer a vessel of secrets, but a beacon of hope and resilience. My father lives with his silence in a small town far away. I live with my peace. He thought the world was a chessboard where power was the only piece that mattered. I proved him wrong. The world also runs on truth, and I had spent 10 years learning its language. The greatest revenge wasn't in destroying the man he was. It was in finally, completely, becoming the woman my mother always knew I could be. A woman who builds, protects and creates using the very skills he tried to use for destruction. The dreamer had awakened, and her reality was more powerful than his darkest nightmare.